The stranger behind my door knew my name. I used to think a house could make almost any sound during a bad storm. Pipes knock, windows flex, branches drag across siding. A loose vent can sound like somebody whispering from another room. Then one night, one of those sounds said my name. My name is Rachel Foster. I was 36 when this happened, and I owned a small 2-story house in a suburb outside Des Moines, Iowa. It wasn't isolated. There were houses on both sides and a family with 2 kids across the street. I worked from home overnight for a roadside assistance company, usually from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., taking calls about dead batteries, flat tires, and locked cars. My office was the smallest bedroom upstairs, with 2 monitors, a headset, and a floor lamp. That night, thunderstorms had been moving through central Iowa since dinner. By midnight, the rain was loud enough to cover most sounds outside. Around 12:40, I finished a call and took off my headset to refill my water. That was when I heard something downstairs. It sounded like a man speaking. Not shouting, just a short sentence, muffled by the floor and the rain. I waited, but it didn't repeat. I went downstairs and checked the living room, kitchen, laundry room, and the smart speaker. Everything looked normal. The back door was locked. The door from the garage was locked too. Outside, the street was empty. I decided I had heard somebody outside and went back to work. About 20 minutes later, I heard it again. This time I was sure it came from inside the house. I pulled one side of my headset away. A man's voice said something from downstairs. I couldn't understand the first word. The second sounded like my name. Rachel? My stomach tightened. I muted my work microphone and called out, "Hello?" There was no answer. I walked to the upstairs railing and looked down into the front entryway. The first floor was mostly dark. I could see part of the kitchen because I had left the stove light on. Nothing moved. I almost called my neighbor, but I felt stupid. I had spent hours listening to voices through a headset and told myself my brain was turning random sounds into words. Then I noticed the basement door. It was open about 6 inches. I always kept it closed because the furnace made my office warmer when that door was open. I went downstairs, turned on the basement light, and listened. The unfinished basement was empty. I heard only the furnace and sump pump, so I shut the door. There was no exterior basement entrance, only narrow glass block windows. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. For the next 2 hours, work got busy and I stopped thinking about the voice. A little after 3 a.m., I went downstairs to make coffee. The basement door was still closed. The front and back doors were still locked, but the door leading into the garage was standing open, not the garage door itself. The interior door between the laundry room and garage. I knew I had checked it earlier. Cold air came through the gap. I didn't go into the dark garage. I shut the door, locked it, and looked through the kitchen window. My car was there, and the overhead door was down. I told myself the latch hadn't caught earlier. That explanation lasted until I went back upstairs. There was something on my desk that hadn't been there before. A folded paper napkin. It was sitting beside my keyboard. I don't keep napkins upstairs. I keep tissues in a drawer, but not napkins. I unfolded it. Nothing was written on it, but it was slightly damp. That was when I stopped explaining things away. Leaving meant taking the stairs past the rest of the house, so I locked my office door. I had never locked it while working before. It was only a simple bedroom lock, but it made me feel less exposed. I called my supervisor and said I had an emergency. While I was speaking, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Then another, closer. I whispered, "I think somebody is in my house." She told me to call 911. I dialed 911 and gave the dispatcher my address as quietly as I could. Then I looked at the bottom of my office door. The hallway light was off, but my desk lamp cast enough light under the door that I could see a thin strip of carpet. A shadow moved across it, then stopped. Someone was standing directly outside my office. The dispatcher asked whether I was alone and whether I could get out through a window. I answered as quietly as possible. The shadow didn't move. For almost a full minute, nothing happened. Then a man spoke from the other side of the door. "Rachel." He said it softly, almost normally. I covered my mouth because I thought I was going to make a sound. He waited. Then he said, "I know you're awake." The dispatcher heard him and told me officers were less than 5 minutes away. The doorknob turned once, slowly. When it stopped against the lock, the man didn't pull or shake it. He just stood there. Then he said something that bothered me more than if he had threatened me. "You don't have to be scared of me." I had never heard his voice before in my life. I didn't answer. A few seconds later, he tried the knob again. Then he knocked 3 times, not hard. Like a guest waiting politely on the other side. "Open the door for 1 minute," he said. "That's all I need." His calmness was worse than yelling. He sounded convinced I would cooperate. The dispatcher told me not to speak to him. The man waited another 30 seconds. Then his voice changed. "Rachel, open it." Still not a shout, but sharper. The knob turned again. The door moved slightly in the frame. I pushed my desk chair under the knob even though I knew it probably wouldn't help much. The chair scraped the floor. The man stopped. His shadow stayed there for several seconds, then moved away. I heard 2 quick steps down the hall and then nothing. The rain swallowed every smaller sound. The dispatcher told me officers had arrived and instructed me not to leave the room until they announced themselves. A few seconds later, red and blue lights flashed through the blinds. I remotely unlocked the front door for police. They searched every room, the basement, garage, attic access, closets, and backyard. Nobody was there. They found the garage side door unlocked. It opened to the narrow walkway between my house and the neighbor's fence. There were marks around the lock that an officer said could have come from a pick or thin tool. Nothing valuable had been taken. My wallet, keys, laptop, and purse were untouched. The only thing missing was the damp napkin from my desk. I had left it beside the keyboard when I locked the office. It was gone when police searched the room. I couldn't explain when it had disappeared. The officers lifted prints, but nothing useful came back. Nobody nearby had seen anyone in the storm. One camera caught distant headlights around 2:50, but no identifiable vehicle. The police asked the obvious question, who knew I worked overnight from home? The answer was more people than I liked. Family, friends, co-workers, and a few neighbors. My first name was easy to find online too, but knowing my name wasn't the part that kept bothering me. It was the timing. The man seemed to know I would be awake at 3 in the morning, upstairs, with headphones on. For several weeks, I worked nights from my sister's house. I replaced every exterior lock. No one came back, and police never identified a suspect. About 2 months later, I hired a company to replace the damaged side door frame on the garage. The carpenter removed the trim and found thin scratches behind the strike plate. Some had been painted over, which meant they were older than the night of the break-in. He believed somebody had worked a tool into that same door more than once. The detective documented the marks, but there was no way to know who made them. That was the last real development. I still own the house, and nothing has happened since. But I no longer think the man came there for the first time that night. And whenever I remember him standing outside my office, calmly saying my name through the door, I always wonder the same thing. If the scratches were already there before that night, how many times had he gotten inside without needing to speak at all? The abandoned motel wasn't empty. The first thing that bothered me about the motel wasn't that the office was empty. It was the coffee. There was a paper cup sitting behind the front desk with steam still coming off it, like whoever had been drinking it had stepped away only a few seconds before I walked in. My name is Daniel Harper. I was 34 and lived in Columbus, Ohio. I had driven to eastern Kentucky to help my younger brother move and took a slower route home through West Virginia because I had the next day off. By late evening, I regretted it. Heavy fog covered the mountain road. Cell service came and went, and after almost 9 hours behind the wheel, my eyes were burning. Around 11:30, I passed an old green sign advertising the Ridgeway Motor Court 2 miles ahead. Vacancy. The sign looked ancient, but the red word underneath it was glowing. I almost kept driving. Then I hit another patch of fog so thick I could barely see the center line. The motel sat in what looked like a dead highway town. A closed diner across the road, a boarded-up tire shop, and dark houses behind overgrown yards. The motor court was a long one-story building with faded doors and rusted chairs outside. There were no cars in the lot. That should have been enough for me to leave. Instead, I parked near the office because the sign was on and the lights inside were burning. The lobby smelled like damp carpet and old cigarettes. A brass bell sat beside a handwritten ring for service sign. I rang it and called out. Nothing. Then I noticed the coffee. It was in a disposable cup behind the counter, next to an open crossword puzzle and a set of keys. I waited, assuming the clerk was in the bathroom. Somewhere farther down the motel, a television was playing. That made me feel a little better. At least somebody seemed to be there. I rang the bell again. This time, the television stopped. Not faded out. Not muted after a commercial. It just went silent. I stood there for a few seconds, listening. Then I heard a door close outside. I walked back into the parking lot. Every motel door I could see was shut. No one was there. I decided I was done. I got into my car, locked the doors, and pulled back onto the road. 3 minutes later, the battery and check engine lights came on. The steering went heavy, and I barely rolled onto a gravel turnout before the engine died. It wouldn't restart. With 1 bar of service, I called roadside assistance. The dispatcher had trouble finding the motel, but eventually said a tow truck could reach me in about an hour. I asked if I should stay with the vehicle. She said yes. I stayed for 20 minutes, but late October temperatures were dropping into the 30s, and my jacket wasn't enough for an hour in a dead car. The motel was less than a quarter mile behind me. I told myself I could wait in the lobby. Even if the clerk was strange, it was warmer than the car, so I walked back. The office door was still unlocked. The coffee cup was gone. That was the first moment I seriously considered that someone had been watching me. The crossword was still there. The keys were still there. But the cup had disappeared. I called out again. No answer. Then an old desk phone behind the counter rang. The sound made me jump. It rang 4 times and stopped before I could decide whether to answer. Maybe 10 seconds later, a room phone somewhere down the hall began ringing. I stepped outside. One of the motel room doors near the far end of the building was now open. Room 12. A pale strip of yellow light fell across the walkway. I couldn't see anyone inside. I stayed where I was and said, "Hello?" A man's voice answered from the room. "You broke down?" He sounded calm, almost friendly. I answered, "Yeah." There was a pause. "Tow truck coming?" I didn't like that question. I said, "Police are on their way." The man gave a quiet laugh. Then the room went dark. I left immediately. I didn't walk back toward my car. I crossed the road and stood beneath the roof of the abandoned diner, where I could see both the motel and the road. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then I saw a flashlight moving near my car. Someone was standing beside it. The person opened my driver's door. I knew I had locked it. I called 911. The dispatcher told me the nearest deputy was about 25 minutes away and ordered me not to approach the vehicle. While I was on the phone, another person came out from behind the motel. He crossed the parking lot slowly, stopped at the edge of the road, and looked directly toward the diner. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he had seen me. He raised one hand and pointed toward my car. Then he waved me over. I backed away from the front of the diner and crouched beside a concrete wall. The dispatcher kept asking what he was doing. I told her I couldn't see him anymore. Then I heard footsteps on gravel. They were crossing the road. I went around the back of the diner and found a steep drainage ditch leading into the trees. It was full of wet leaves and trash, but I climbed down and moved into the woods. I went maybe 100 yards into the trees and crouched behind a fallen trunk while the dispatcher kept me talking. Twice, I heard branches snap somewhere closer to the road. Once, I saw a white flashlight beam move between the trees. Then it disappeared. The deputy arrived 17 minutes later and waited for a second unit before coming into the woods. By then, the motel was dark. The vacancy sign was off. My car was still on the turnout, but the driver's door was hanging open. Nothing inside had been stolen. My wallet was in the center console. My laptop was in the trunk. Even the loose cash in the cup holder was untouched. The deputy searched the motel with another officer. They found no one. What they did find made the situation worse. The building had been condemned almost 2 years earlier after part of the roof collapsed. It had no active electrical account. The lights I had seen were being powered by extension cords running to a portable generator behind the building. Inside room 12, officers found a folding chair, several empty water bottles, and cigarette butts. No identification, no luggage, nothing that told them who had been there. The front office was almost empty. There was no coffee machine. The paper cup I had seen was gone. The tow truck arrived around 1:30 in the morning. The driver was a man named Curtis who had grown up in the county. When I told him what happened, he looked back toward the motel and asked exactly where I had parked. I pointed to the space near the office. He shook his head and said, "People still stop there because that sign works sometimes." I asked what he meant by sometimes. He said the sign had been disconnected when the place closed. Someone kept reconnecting it. The sheriff's department had removed the power cable twice. It always came back. Curtis said the settlement had served a coal operation farther up the mountain. When the mine closed, the families left, then the businesses. Several houses still stood behind the trees, but as far as he knew, none were legally occupied. The next morning, a mechanic found the problem. A connector to the alternator had been unplugged. It wasn't where and couldn't have happened while I was driving. Someone had opened my hood. I told the deputy. They took another report and checked the motel again, but whoever had been there never returned while the police were watching it. At least, not that they told me. A few weeks later, the sheriff's office called. Neither man had been identified. There were no usable prints, no clear camera footage, and nothing had been stolen. The deputy said the best guess was that someone had tampered with the vehicle while I was inside the lobby, expecting me to come back when it died. He couldn't tell me what they wanted after that. Dad came home, but he was still an hour away. When I was 21, I learned how dangerous a familiar sound can be. It was a little after 2 in the morning when I heard a key turn in our front door downstairs. I was half asleep, so I didn't even sit up. My dad often came home late, and I knew the sounds of him coming into the house almost without thinking, the door closing, his shoes on the hardwood, the kitchen cabinet opening. So when I heard someone moving downstairs that night, I wasn't scared. I was 21 when this happened. My name is Emily Carter, and I still lived with my dad in the house where I grew up, outside Westerville, Ohio. It was a normal 2-story place with an attached garage and a small fenced backyard. My dad, Daniel, worked as an industrial electrician almost an hour away. His schedule was unpredictable, and I was used to hearing him come home anywhere from midnight to 3 in the morning. That Thursday in November, I had skipped my afternoon college classes because of a migraine. By evening I felt better, heated up soup, watched television downstairs, and went to my room around 11. Dad texted me a little after 11:20. Machine issue. Going to be late again. Don't wait up. I sent back a thumbs up and asked if he wanted me to leave dinner in the fridge. He said yes. The door between the garage and mudroom had a smart lock. Dad used it every day. The correct code made a short chirp, followed by the click of the deadbolt. I had heard those 2 sounds thousands of times. Sometime after 1 in the morning, they woke me up. Chirp, click. Then the mudroom door opened and closed downstairs. I didn't even check the time. My first thought was simply, Dad's home. I rolled over and pulled the blanket higher. A few seconds later, I heard the kitchen floor creak, then the soft thud of something being set on the counter. That also seemed normal. Dad always dropped his wallet and keys into a wooden tray beside the refrigerator. I heard the refrigerator open, cabinet door, running water for a few seconds. Then quiet. I was half asleep again when the stairs creaked. Our staircase had one step near the top that made a sharp pop if you put weight on the left side. Dad knew about it but stepped there constantly. The footsteps reached the upstairs hallway and stopped outside my room. Dad usually checked on me when he came home late, even though I was an adult. He would open the door 2 inches, see that I was asleep, then close it again. My door slowly opened. The hallway was dark, but there was a streetlight outside the window behind the person. I could see the outline of a man standing there. He looked roughly like my dad. Similar height, broad shoulders, a baseball cap. I kept my eyes almost closed because I didn't feel like talking. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. At first, I wasn't scared. I was annoyed. After maybe 10 seconds, I opened my eyes a little more. He was still watching me. I whispered, "Dad." The man didn't answer. He shifted his weight, and for 1 second I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. Then he stepped backward and pulled the door almost shut. Almost. He left it open about 6 inches. That was the first thing that felt wrong. My dad always closed doors. He was obsessive about heating bills and used to complain that I left rooms open during winter. I listened as the man walked farther down the hallway toward my dad's bedroom. bedroom door opened. Then nothing. I lay there trying to think. Maybe Dad was exhausted or quietly talking on his phone. My own phone was charging on the nightstand. I picked it up mostly to check the time. 1:47 a.m. There were 2 unread messages from Dad. The first had come at 1:31. Finally finished. Cleaning up and heading out soon. The second was from 1:42, 5 minutes earlier. Leaving now. Roads look bad. Probably 55 minutes. I read that message 3 times. Then I looked at the 6-inch opening in my bedroom door. I could see nothing except darkness. For several seconds, I tried to explain it away. Maybe the text had been delayed. Then I opened our location sharing app. His phone was moving south on Interstate 71, almost 50 miles away. I felt something cold move through my stomach. There was a man in my dad's bedroom. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and closed my door. The latch sounded incredibly loud. I turned the small lock in the knob. Almost immediately, something moved in the hallway. One floorboard creaked. Then another. The footsteps came back toward me. They stopped outside my room. I stood beside my bed, holding my phone with both hands. The knob moved once, very slowly. It stopped when the lock caught. I don't think I've ever been as scared as I was during the next few seconds. The person didn't force the door. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just stayed there. I could see a thin shadow blocking the light beneath the door. I called 911 and kept the phone pressed against my ear, barely whispering my address. The dispatcher said officers were on the way and asked whether I had another exit. My window opened onto the porch roof, but the shingles were wet and the drop was too far unless the door started opening. The shadow remained outside. Then my phone vibrated against my cheek. Dad was calling. I declined it. The vibration must have been audible because the shadow beneath my door shifted. A second later, the footsteps moved quickly away. Not running, just fast. They went down the stairs. I heard the mudroom door open. Then the electronic lock gave one chirp. After that, the house was silent. I stayed locked in my room until police arrived. Three officers searched the house, garage, yard, and the woods behind our fence. They found no one. Nothing obvious had been stolen. My dad's wallet was still in his bedroom dresser. His laptop was on the desk. The television, game console, and my purse downstairs hadn't been touched. Even stranger, the kitchen looked almost exactly the way I had left it. There was no glass in the sink, no food missing from the refrigerator, nothing in the trash. The sounds I had heard downstairs, the refrigerator, the cabinet, the water, apparently had been made for no reason I could understand. Dad arrived while the police were still there. I remember him coming through the front door instead of the garage and looking more frightened than I was. He kept asking the same question. "You actually saw him?" I told him I had only seen a silhouette. One officer checked the exterior doors and windows. There were no pry marks and no broken locks. The garage door itself had remained closed all night. That meant the man had entered through the door connecting the garage to the house. But to reach that door, he first had to get into the garage. We had a keypad outside. Dad checked the smart home history on his phone. The garage door had opened at 1:36 a.m. and closed again less than a minute later. Someone had entered using a valid keypad code. The police asked who knew it. I knew my own code. Dad had a different one. My aunt had a temporary code from the previous summer, but Dad had deleted it months earlier. No one else was supposed to have access. The officers took the report and checked a few neighbors' cameras. One camera across the street showed a dark figure walking along the sidewalk shortly before 1:30, but the person was too far away to identify. No vehicle could be connected to him. By morning, whoever had been inside our house was simply gone. For weeks, Dad and I considered former co-workers, contractors, friends, and people who had visited years earlier. Nothing fit. Dad replaced the garage opener, the smart lock, and every exterior lock. We also added cameras facing the driveway and backyard. About 2 months later, Dad contacted the company that made the smart lock because he wanted a complete activity log for the night of the break-in. The basic app only showed that the door had opened. The company was able to provide more detailed information tied to the individual access codes. That was the part I still think about. The code used at 1:36 that morning wasn't mine. It was Dad's. He had changed his personal code only 12 days before the incident because one of the buttons on the keypad had started sticking. He hadn't written the new number down. He hadn't texted it to anyone. He hadn't even told me what it was. The police added that information to the report, but it never led anywhere. I'm 26 now. Dad still lives there, and nothing strange has happened since. But whenever I stay overnight, I lock my bedroom door.